Look up on the right night, far from the city, and you might see them. A perfect line of lights, dozens of them, gliding across the black information. Too steady to be planes, too many and too evenly spaced to be stars. People have called the police about it. They've filed reports of an alien fleet. What they're actually watching is a freshly launched batch of satellites, strung out like a string of pearls before they climb to their final orbits. There are now more than 6,000 of them up there. One company put almost all of them in the sky in about 5 years. To feel that number, for the entire history of the space age, every nation on Earth combined had launched fewer working satellites than this single constellation holds today. More than half of every active satellite circling our planet belongs to one company. And here is the part that should stop you. Almost everyone who tried to build something like this before went bankrupt doing it. So how do you build 6,000 machines that each have to survive the brutality of space? And why did this exact dream nearly kill everyone who chased it first? To understand that, you have to start in the graveyard. In the late 1990s, the smartest people in technology were certain that satellites would deliver the internet to the whole planet. They were wrong in the most expensive way imaginable. The most famous casualty was a company called Iridium. Backed by Motorola, it launched 66 satellites to bring phone service to every point on Earth. It was a genuine engineering marvel. It was also a financial catastrophe. The handsets were the size of bricks, the calls cost a fortune, and within 9 months of switching the network on, the company filed for bankruptcy. Around $5 billion, gone. Then came Teledesic, backed by Bill Gates and the cellular pioneer Craig McCaw. It promised an internet in the sky, hundreds of satellites blanketing the globe. It raised and burned through enormous sums and never launched an operational network. By the early 2000s, it was dead too. The pattern was brutal and it was consistent. Satellite internet was the place where ambition and capital went to die. The physics was punishing. The satellites were ruinously expensive, and the rockets to lift them cost more than you could ever earn back. By the time most engineers heard the phrase, they flinched. If you're finding this interesting, take a second to subscribe. We take apart a build like this every week. Because 2 decades after the graveyard filled up, one company looked at the very same problem and saw something nobody else could. To understand what they saw, you first have to understand why the old satellites were so bad at the internet. Almost every communications satellite ever flown sits in one specific place, a ring about 35,000 kilometers above the equator, called geostationary orbit. At that exact altitude, a satellite circles the planet at the same speed the planet spins, so from the ground it appears to hang perfectly still in the sky. That is wildly useful. You can bolt a dish to your roof, aim it once, and never touch it again. But there is a price, and it is written directly into physics. 35,000 kilometers is staggeringly far. Even at the speed of light, your signal has to climb all the way up to the satellite and fall all the way back down, and then make the same trip again to bring the answer. That round journey takes roughly half a second. For a phone call, it is merely annoying. For a video call, an online game, a modern website that pings a server hundreds of times a second, it is simply broken. The fix is almost insulting in how obvious it is. Fly lower. Drop to a few hundred kilometers, and the lag nearly vanishes. But low orbit carries its own curse. Down there, a satellite cannot hang still. It screams around the Earth in about 90 minutes, and each one only sees a small patch of ground at any moment. To blanket the whole planet without gaps, you do not need one satellite, or 10. You need thousands. And thousands of satellites was an answer almost nobody alive could afford. Here is what they saw. The reason satellite internet kept dying was never really the satellites. It was the launch. Every company before them had to buy rides to orbit from somebody else, at $60 million or more per flight, on rockets that were thrown away after a single use. To loft a constellation of thousands, you would spend tens of billions on launches alone, money you could never claw back from internet subscribers. The math simply never closed. It couldn't. But by the middle of the last decade, one company had quietly solved the exact piece that had killed everyone else. SpaceX had built the Falcon 9, and more importantly, it had learned to land that rocket and fly it again. A reused booster cut the cost of reaching orbit like nothing in the history of spaceflight. And then came the move that changed everything. SpaceX did not have to sell those launches to an outside customer at all. It could be its own customer. It could build a satellite network and lift it on its own rockets, at cost, with no middleman taking a cut on every flight. The single most expensive line in the entire business, getting to space, was something they already owned outright. That is the insight the graveyard missed completely. You don't win satellite internet by building a better satellite. You win it by owning the rocket. But owning the rocket only solved half the problem. They still had to build the satellites. Thousands of them, and nobody on Earth built satellites the way SpaceX was about to. The aerospace industry had built satellites the same way for 60 years. Each one was a precious handcrafted jewel. Engineers would spend years on a single spacecraft, gold-plating every component, testing it obsessively, because once it launched, there was no fixing it. And it had to keep working for 15 years. A communications satellite could cost hundreds of millions of dollars. You built one. Maybe two. SpaceX looked at all of that and did something close to heresy. They decided to build satellites the way a car company builds cars. Cheap, fast, on an assembly line, and, crucially, disposable. If a satellite only lasts about 5 years before it burns up in the atmosphere, that's fine, because by then you've already launched a better version to replace it. To pull it off, they threw out the textbook. Instead of a boxy spacecraft bristling with dishes and booms, they designed a flat panel. Picture a table-sized slab packed with antennas and electronics, with a single solar wing that unfolds once it reaches orbit. Flat meant you could stack them. And stacked, you could cram dozens into a single rocket. They built the production lines in Redmond, Washington, and ran them like a factory floor, not a research lab. Parts the old industry would have custom machined. SpaceX bought off the shelf or made in-house by the thousand. The target was audacious to the point of absurd. Not one satellite a year, not one a month. The eventual goal was a satellite a day, which forced them to rethink what a satellite even was. By 2019, the factory was humming in a way aerospace had simply never seen. Picture the old way, a satellite, singular, rolling out of a clean room to ceremony and applause, once a year. Now picture the SpaceX line, flat satellites coming off the floor faster than rockets could carry them away. At the peak, more than 6 a week, stacked like dinner plates, waiting their turn for the sky. The design was what made it possible, because each satellite was a flat slab. 60 of them could be stacked into a single tube inside the rocket's nose cone. No dispenser, no complicated cradle, just a column of spacecraft. When the rocket reached orbit, it simply rotated and released a tension rod, and all 60 drifted apart like a deck of cards fanned into the dark. Each one then unfolded its solar wing and lit its thrusters to climb toward its assigned slot. This was the thing the graveyard could never have built. The old Iridium network took a full year to deploy 66 satellites. SpaceX could now put 60 into orbit in a single afternoon, and then do it again 2 weeks later and 2 weeks after that. The constellation wasn't being carefully assembled. It was being mass-produced and poured into the sky. By the end of 2020, there were already more Starlink satellites circling Earth than any other kind of object humanity had ever launched, from any nation, in all of history. And it was only getting started. But getting started was messy. The first full batch of 60 operational satellites went up in May of 2019, and the honest truth is, they were rough. The design was still half-finished. Some of the early satellites failed outright. A handful never responded at all. Others had to be deliberately steered back down to burn up, because they weren't healthy enough to trust in orbit. This was the hidden cost of building like a car company. Your early models have bugs, and you are finding those bugs in production, in public, 200 miles overhead. Each satellite had to raise its own orbit using a tiny krypton thruster, drifting upward over weeks under its own faint power. Steering thousands of these machines, keeping them from drifting into one another, demanded software that mostly did not exist yet. But this is exactly where the SpaceX approach paid off. When your satellites are cheap, and a fresh batch goes up every couple of weeks, every failure becomes a lesson you can apply almost immediately. The next batch is better. The one after that, better still. Where the old industry got a single shot every few years to learn anything, SpaceX got dozens of shots a year. The failure rate dropped, the designs hardened, and as the count climbed past hundreds and on toward thousands, the thing that had looked reckless slowly started to look like the only sane way to build a constellation this size. All of this orbital engineering meant nothing if a normal person couldn't actually connect to it. And that turned out to be a second problem, almost as hard as the first, the thing that sits on your roof. Think about what it has to do. A Starlink satellite isn't parked motionless in the sky like the old ones. It is racing overhead at about 27,000 kilometers an hour, in view for only a few minutes before the next one takes its place. A traditional dish would have to physically swivel to track it, then whip across the sky to catch the next, over and over, all day. Mechanically, that is a nightmare, so SpaceX built something far cleverer, a flat phased array antenna. Instead of moving, it stays perfectly still and steers its beam electronically, using software to aim instantly at whichever satellite is overhead and hand off to the next, with no moving parts at all. Customers nicknamed it Dishy. You set it down with a clear view up, it finds the sky by itself, and it simply works. The catch was the cost. Early on, each terminal reportedly cost the company around $3,000 to build. They sold it to customers for a few hundred. That gap, selling a device for a fraction of what it costs to make, was a deliberate bet. Get the hardware into homes, win the subscriber, and earn the money back on the monthly service. It was the hardest piece of consumer space hardware ever mass-produced, and the entire point was that the customer never had to think about any of it. For the first few years, Starlink carried a hidden limitation. A satellite could only relay your data if it could also see a ground station, a base on Earth wired straight into the internet backbone. Over land, that was fine. But over the middle of an ocean, or up near the poles, or anywhere truly remote, there was simply no ground station in range. The very places that needed satellite internet the most were the places it couldn't yet reach. The fix sounds like science fiction, because it nearly is. SpaceX began equipping the satellites with laser links, invisible optical beams that let them talk directly to each other across the vacuum of space. A satellite over the Atlantic could fire a pencil-thin laser to its neighbor, which passed it to the next, routing your data through a moving mesh of spacecraft until it found one that could see a ground station on a continent thousands of kilometers away. And here is the genuinely elegant part. Light travels faster through the emptiness of space than it does through the glass fiber buried under the oceans. Over very long distances, a signal hopping across this chain of orbiting lasers can actually beat the undersea cable. The constellation stopped being a loose collection of satellites each relaying down to the ground. It became a single machine, a living web of light wrapped around the entire planet, carrying data above places no cable had ever been laid. By 2022, the first version of the constellation was working, profitable in places, and growing fast. But SpaceX wasn't slowing down. It was scaling the ambition. The next generation of satellites, the version 2 design, was far bigger and far heavier, with several times the capacity of the originals. There was just one problem. They were too big to launch 60 at a time on a Falcon 9. To fly enough of them, SpaceX would need its giant new rocket Starship, the largest launch vehicle ever built, designed to carry these new satellites by the dozen. Then came the move that turned Starlink from an internet company into something far stranger. Direct to cell. The newest satellites could beam a signal straight to an ordinary unmodified smartphone on the ground. No dish. No special hardware. Just the phone already sitting in your pocket. In effect, every satellite became a cell tower in space, able to reach the dead zones no carrier had ever found it worth wiring. The deserts, the mountains, the open ocean. Suddenly, the constellation was no longer just a way to get broadband to a farmhouse. It was becoming raw infrastructure. A layer of connectivity draped over the entire surface of the planet, reaching the places the ground-bound world had always left dark. But building something this big, this fast, always comes with a bill. And the first people to demand payment were watching from the tops of the world's mountains. Within weeks of that very first launch, the complaints began, and they came from the people who study the sky for a living. Astronomers pointed their telescopes upward and found their images ruined. Bright streaks slashed across long exposure photographs of distant galaxies, left by Starlink satellites catching the sun and dragging lines of light straight through the data. A network built to connect the ground was photobombing humanity's view of the universe. The scale of it was the real problem. For all of recorded history, the night sky held a roughly fixed number of bright moving objects. Now one company was adding thousands of them, far more reflective than anyone had expected, crawling through nearly every observatory's field of view. Astronomers warned that the next generation of great survey telescopes, built to photograph the entire sky, could find a serious fraction of their images scarred by satellite trails. To its credit, SpaceX took the warning seriously and engineered fixes. A darkened test satellite, sun visors to block the reflection, special coatings to dull the shine. They helped. They did not solve it. And there was a second, quieter threat underneath, the faint radio chatter of the satellites bleeding into the delicate frequencies radio astronomers used to listen to the early universe. This was the bargain nobody ever voted on. The price of wiring the surface of the planet was disrupting the oldest science we have, our long, patient look upward into the dark. And the sky wasn't only getting brighter, it was getting crowded. With thousands of satellites racing around the same thin band of low orbit, the risk of collision stopped being theoretical. Starlink satellites now perform tens of thousands of automatic avoidance maneuvers a year, quietly nudging themselves out of the path of other spacecraft and old debris, guided by software that tracks everything else up there. The nightmare scenario even has a name: Kessler syndrome. The idea is chilling in how simple it is. If two large objects collide in orbit, they shatter into thousands of fragments, and each fragment becomes a bullet that can strike another satellite, which shatters into thousands more. A single crash could in theory cascade into a chain reaction that fills low orbit with shrapnel and walls off space for generations. SpaceX's defense is built right into the design. Starlink flies low enough that a dead satellite, with no power left to hold its altitude, naturally spirals down and burns up in the atmosphere within a few years. The orbit cleans itself, instead of hoarding wreckage forever. Combined with the autonomous avoidance, it is a genuinely thoughtful answer. But thoughtful or not, the orbit is filling. Other companies and other nations are now racing to launch their own mega constellations. Tens of thousands more satellites planned for the very same shell of space. The low orbit that made Starlink possible has become the most contested real estate above our heads. In February of 2022, the abstract question of who controls all of this connectivity turned suddenly, violently concrete. Russia invaded Ukraine, and within days large parts of the country's communications were knocked offline. Then thousands of Starlink terminals arrived. Almost overnight, a commercial internet service became frontline military infrastructure, coordinating units, flying drones, keeping a nation online while its towers were being shelled. It worked because the constellation could do what no government system could: deliver bandwidth anywhere, instantly, beamed down from space. But it also exposed something the engineering had quietly created. The decisions about where this network would and would not function, which regions it covered, when it stayed switched on, increasingly came down to a single private company, and at moments to a single person at the top of it. There were public disputes over coverage near contested zones, over who pays, over whether a commercial service should be steering the communications of an active war. Governments that had cheered the technology suddenly grasped how much they now leaned on infrastructure they did not own and could not fully command. This is the strange place the whole build finally led. SpaceX set out to sell internet to rural households. What it actually constructed is the most capable communications network ever flown, and the most powerful one off the surface of the Earth now answers in the end to a private company rather than to any nation or treaty. Step back from the politics, and underneath it all is a business that earlier companies died trying to build. By the middle of the 2020s, Starlink had millions of subscribers spread across most of the world. From remote farmhouses to passenger airliners to cargo ships in the middle of the sea. It crossed into profitability, the exact thing that had bankrupted the satellite internet pioneers a generation before. The old curse was finally broken, but here is the detail that reframes the entire story. For SpaceX, Starlink was never really the destination, it was the funding. Launching rockets is brutally expensive, and the stated reason for the whole company, from the very beginning, has been a self-sustaining city on Mars. A global internet service throwing off billions in cash flow is, in that light, simply the engine that pays for the dream, connecting the surface of one planet in order to fund the journey to another. It is an almost dizzying piece of logic. The same reusable rocket built to reach Mars is what made the constellation affordable. The constellation makes the money funds the rocket. Each piece justifies the next, in a loop that only closes if all of it works at once. Whether you find that inspiring or unsettling, it is a genuinely new kind of machine. A private company building infrastructure around one world to bankroll a foothold on the next. So here is the whole arc, in a single breath. A graveyard of bankruptcies. A physics problem every engineer understood and almost nobody could afford to solve. And one company that, almost by accident, already owned the one thing that made it possible. A rocket it could fly again, and again, and again. They didn't beat the satellite internet curse with a smarter satellite. They beat it by building satellites like cars, by owning the launch, and by accepting a trade the rest of us were never actually asked about. That the night sky, humanity's oldest shared view, would never look quite the same again. 6,000 machines and counting circling overhead right now, carrying a video call between two strangers on opposite sides of an ocean, and at the very same moment dragging a bright line through an astronomer's long photograph of a galaxy we will never reach. That is the bargain of Starlink. Connection for everyone down here, paid for in part by what we gave up looking up. A constellation that began as a way to fund a trip to Mars, Built, like everything on this channel, from nothing. If the real cost and the real engineering behind the things we take for granted is what you came here for, subscribe and stay for the next build.